Welcome to the Positive Link Speaker Series session entitled The Trouble with Talent, Why Describing Ability as Talent May Undermine Grit in the Workplace. It's presented by the Center for Positive Organizations at the University of Michigan's Stephen M. Ross School of Business. I'm Kim Cameron, a faculty member at Michigan Ross, and one of the co-founders of the Center for Positive Organizations. A few notes of technology that we're using today. During today's events, attendees will be in view-only mode, so you cannot be seen or heard. We have turned off the chat, the Q&A, and the raise hand features. We have, however, enabled live transcription services for this event, so this feature can be turned on or off using the Zoom settings at the bottom of your screen. If you prefer not to have the writing on your screen, you can turn that off. Finally, we are recording the event, and we will post the video on the Center for Positive Organizations website as soon as we're able, which will be this coming week. Most importantly, the Center for Positive Organizations thanks the Sanger Leadership Center, Tauber Institute for Global Operations, both at the University of Michigan, Samuel Zell and Robert H. Laurie Institute for Entrepreneurial Studies at the University of Michigan, Lisa and David Drews, and also Diane and Paul Jones, individuals who are great friends of the center and of the university, for their sponsorship and support of this 2020-2021 Positive Links series. We also want to thank our series promotional partners, Ann Arbor Spark and the Managerial and Organization Cognition Division at the Academy of Management. We'll invite our two spectacular guests to turn on their screens. I'd like to introduce both Angela and Danny. When Sherry, and by the way, I have to thank Sherry Phillip, who's the Chief Technologist, Sue Rule, who's in charge of everything, and Angie, who gives everybody else directions and who really is the boss. They're behind the scenes, you won't see them, but they're wonderful and spectacular. When Angie asked if I could call Angela and ask her to consider coming on this PosLink series, I thought no chance in the world. She's got lots of other obligations and there's no way that she'll do it. And she immediately said yes. She was wonderful. So let me introduce, you know her by reputation, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about her. So Angela's the founder and the CEO of Character Lab, a not-for-profit organization whose mission is to advance scientific insights that help children thrive. She's also a professor of psychology at the University of Pennsylvania, and in 2013 was named a MacArthur Fellow. Now you have to have an IQ point above 180 to get a MacArthur Fellow. I mean, it's called the Genius Award for good reason. Prior to her career in research, she was a math and science teacher in public schools in New York City, San Francisco, and Philadelphia. Probably the single most difficult job on the planet. Angela shares research-based advice to parents and teachers in her tip of the week, which I received, by the way. Angela completed her undergraduate degree in advanced studies neurobiology at Harvard, magna cum laude. And then with the support of a Marshall Scholarship, I helped a young man several months ago apply for and eventually finally win a Marshall Scholarship. That is a big deal. Well, Angela was a winner of the Marshall Scholarship. So she completed a Master of Science degree with distinction in neuroscience at Oxford University. And then she came back and completed her PhD in psychology as a National Science Foundation graduate fellow at the University of Pennsylvania. Angela's TED Talk, if you haven't seen it, see it, you must, and most of you probably have, is among the most viewed TED Talks of all time. And of course, her book on grit, which many of you know about already, many of us have read, was a number one New York Times bestseller. Excuse me. She's also currently, with a colleague, Steve Dubner, host of a podcast called No Stupid Questions, worth your time. So thanks, Angela. And Angela's star doctoral student, Danny Southwick, is also going to share really interesting work, really interesting research. No surprise, because he's got such an interesting background. So Danny works, in addition to his PhD program, as a research consultant at High Performance Institute. But what's really interesting to me is that he holds a master's in applied psychology degree, a MAP degree from Penn, the kind of founder, the grandfather of all MAP degrees, of which there are almost a dozen now across the world. He has an MBA from the University of California at Irvine. And what was interesting to me is his earlier life was spent in professional football as a quarterback. So he played for a variety of teams in the Arena Football League before it closed for financial reasons. But I didn't list all the teams, but about 6 or 7 different teams. Danny was a quarterback. And ended up, he played for Philadelphia, played for California teams and so on. Excuse me. On a personal note, he's the father of 3 little sweet children. One is 2 months old. He's getting sleep, but his wife is not, I suspect. And he happens to be the stepson of the TV talk show host, Larry King, who, and the reason I mention that is that he just passed away, I think, a month ago or so. So condolences, Danny, to you. So we are so delighted. Danny's been doing research on the idea of talent because he is one, and Angela on grit because she is one as well. So I want to start, maybe, Angela, with having you share with us, because lots of folks are here online, 685 and counting. What in the world is grit, and who cares?
Grit is Tom Brady. Okay, I have more to say about that. But Kim, thank you very much for having us both here. I can't wait till I can come back to Zingerman's and have a really enormous, but also extremely expensive sandwich in good company. Grit I define as the combination of passion and perseverance for really long-term goals. And I think actually that's what makes grit different from, being a conscientious person or even a self-controlled person. It's really about this extended time frame that can be years, decades. And I was only half joking. Actually, I wasn't joking about Tom Brady. And in a paper that Danny and I co-authored, Danny being the first author, we were glad to line up the academic references, but we were also glad to quote the great Tom Brady about what it really means to be somebody who pursues excellence in a domain for a very long time. And so it's different from talent, which we'll also talk about in this conversation. I think it's also different from luck. And it's not the only thing that a leader or a parent or an individual should care about, but it does seem to be a common denominator among high performers across all kinds of fields.
So I want to have you keep going a bit on this. When grit came out, there were a bunch of psychologists said, oh, this is just resilience. It's just a whole bunch of other terms, which you have done a really nice job in that article. Differentiating grit from other similar psychological concepts. And that's kind of an academic's area of interest. What in the world is this really? So I'm interested in having you say a few more words about what it is and what it isn't. And then I'm going to ask you about why people have grabbed you, the equivalents of Tom Brady only in the Northwest, have grabbed you to come help them.
Tom Brady has not yet grabbed me to come help him, by the way, but in case Tom Brady's listening, I would love to, and Danny would also love to do that. Yeah, it is a little bit of and I understand that we're a broad audience and many people on this call are not academics and don't want to talk about exploratory factor analysis or models. But I will say that to me, what makes grit special and different from closely related, but not the same personal qualities is this dual emphasis, not only on working really hard with resilience over a long time, that's perseverance, right? But also the passion piece. So it's really this combination of working really hard in a resilient way for a long time on something that you are deeply committed to in a very intrinsic way. So when I look at the people who are exemplary, models of grit, in business or on the playing field or in, politics, what you find is that they are not only working really hard, but they're also doing something which they would even say, like, it's who I am, actually, at the very edge of grit, like, the people who would 5 out of 5 on the grit scale. So what Danny and I have actually lately been thinking about is why, like, what is underneath the skin of these people? Like, what gets them up at 4 a.m. to start? And and it's the consistency too. I mean, if you look at any interview or like serious study of the life of Tom Brady, I mean, what's remarkable is not just the intensity, it's the consistency. I mean, you could drop into his life on any day in the last 2 decades and you would know exactly what you were going to get. I mean, the focus on goals and improvement was not like a flash in the pan. It was just the opposite. And I think what's underneath the skin of somebody like that is what Danny and I would say is like a goal hierarchy, where you have a top level goal that is about your identity, be the best I can be, bring out other people's, potential. I know Danny has a top level goal. You can ask him what his is. Mine is use psychological science to help kids thrive. Like, that's for me the North Star. And then we kind of line up our, mid-level goals and our to-do lists for this week underneath it. And I think that clarity of like what I'm about, how I'm trying to reach it, I think that is why there is this pattern that's then observable to other people, perseverance for long-term goals married with passion. But underneath that is in some ways the more interesting stuff, because it then suggests, like, if you do want to be a little more like Tom Brady, then maybe one of the first steps is to ask yourself, like, what are my goals? How lined up are they? And could I define my top level goal in a phrase of 10 or fewer words, for example?
Yeah, that's wonderful. And it really relates a bit to Danny, who's a quarterback, probably didn't replace Tom Brady. At least I'm not sure about the talent level, but but it's an incredible accomplishment to be a quarterback, be a professional level quarterback. And it relates to talent, the idea of, hey, I'm really good at this. But Danny's done interesting work questioning the use of that word talent. Danny, why don't you talk about the sort of interesting work you've done? You've written an interesting paper about the advantages and liabilities of using the word talent when you're referring to individuals, quarterbacks, and others, employees.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll begin by just saying that, Tom Brady has gone on record as saying he doesn't consider himself talented. But a broader question is, what does talent even mean? So a little bit of like autobiographical information as to why I was interested in this concept in the first place. Before I spent all those years in the Arena Football League, I was with the Oakland Raiders, about this long. And when I was brought there, a scout recognized probably that this was a new experience for me, and he wanted to inject some confidence and share his opinion. He said, "Dan, I've been doing this for 30 years. I've seen the best, I've seen the worst. Trust me, Danny, you have the talent to play in the NFL. You can be a player on this team. Shortly thereafter, I meet the quarterback coach. First meeting with him, sits me down. Almost first thing he says to me is, Danny, I've been doing this for 30 years. Seen the coach Joe Montana, seen the best and the worst. Trust me, you don't have the talent to play in the NFL. So in addition to that being why I'm now a PhD student working under Angela, it got me thinking about, what is talent and why can experts disagree about this, so vehemently? So about 3 years ago, Angela and I began asking people, how do you define talent? And our inspiration for asking that question is even in the academic literature, it's kind of all over the place. Talent's a skill, talent's a person. I think in organizational research, it's defined as an employee. It's an innate ability. We wanted to see where people's were coming down on what it actually meant. And in surveys, turns out that people, both human resource professionals and lay people, kind of have really diverse opinions and sometimes conflicting opinions, even in their own answer about what talent is. Some people think it's a skill, like a really learned thing. Some people think it's more like a gift, something that's really innate. A lot of people think it's some combination of both. And that got us wondering, might there be consequences to using a term that seems to have inconsistent definitions across people? So it's really important when we're communicating to send clear messages about what we mean, especially if we're talking about someone's ability. Can I learn? Can I grow? And if we're sharing something we might think is positive, you're a talent, I think you can develop. Somebody else might not be hearing it that way. And that's kind of what our research starts to unpack a little bit.
So is grit a talent?
Danny and I would say no. But I think the reason why we would say no is maybe twofold. One is when we have measures of quote unquote talent, right? Or things that people think are talent, like IQ scores or, standardized achievement test scores, or I've worked at West Point for over a decade, and they have a measure of what, the generals call physical talent. So this is a battery of 6 tests that are administered when you're like 17 or so. And that's to measure your physical aptitude and potential. The correlation between measures of grit, like the grit scale, and measures of talent, like I just mentioned, are typically 0, or actually at West Point, they're in some cases sometimes negative weekly. In other words, they seem to be very different things. That's one reason why I don't think Danny and I would say that talent and grit are the same thing. But the deeper reason is I think that we're now starting to wonder whether we should try to wean ourselves off of this magical word talent altogether, because it can be confusing. And we hear it every day, right? I mean, it's not just like Super Bowl season where you talk about talent. It's in the sports pages every day. It's also in the business pages. I remember when you mentioned, Kim, that there was this TED Talk that I, had the very good fortune of giving. And I'm like sitting in the chair getting like my hair done or whatever. And like the makeup artist is like on her earpiece, just like, oh, talent showing up to like they're at the left door, send the talent over to the right door. So we use it all the time. But the reason Danny thinks it might be dangerous is that some of the connotations of talent, which again, it's confusing, it's mixed, but it can actually, for some people, when they hear the word, they think you mean something which is fixed. They think you mean something which is more innate than learned, or at least can carry that connotation.
Yeah. Thank you, Angela. Danny, say more about talent, because you've argued in your paper that, similar to what Angela said, talent sometimes is a real disadvantage, calling somebody a talent. Do you want to kind of make that case for us that you made in that paper? It was good. It was good.
Sure. So it's a bit of a loaded term, right? We might mean it different ways. If someone is interpreting this as this is an innate and unchangeable feature of somebody. There's some people have talent, some people don't. We have talent in different areas. What that does is that can decrease people's expectancy that hard work will do anything. So in our research, we show that when people describe a domain, whether it be basketball or business or singing, as a talent, they think that persistence is less valuable. They think that improvement is less possible. And organizations, when they deem a certain skill as being more talent-like, a certain ability, I should say, as being more talent-like, they actually are less likely to allocate resources towards employee development. They're more likely to want to recruit people because you can't change it. I need to find people that have it. And so actually it affects, if you just frame something like our organization lacks talent, then the people within that organization are more likely to allocate resources toward recruiting new people. But if you say they lack skill, on the other hand, now they want to develop. And so it's important to, these words, even though they're really used as synonyms, by the way, more than 50% of the time, if you ask people just what's a synonym for talent, they'll say skill. So these words are really commonly used synonyms, but they have implications. Which one we use that carry certain connotations about the possibility for improvement, which can affect people's decision-making and motivation.
Yeah. Which is helpful to really just get a sense of, the way we use our language has connotations that sometimes we're not even aware of. What's interesting to me is Pete Carroll, Seattle Seahawks, has a great record. I actually wrote a paper about the culture of the Seattle Seahawks compared to the culture of the Miami Dolphins. And it's a dramatic difference in, in terms of draft choices and so on, reasonably similar. Records are dramatically different. Pete Carroll's done a spectacular job. And what's interesting is Pete Carroll called up Angela and said, come help us figure out how to work with our talent, or some set of folks. What happened, Angela? You want to talk about that?
Well, among the three of us, I know the least about football, honestly, but I got a call from Pete Carroll. And by the way, I have to say that for me, one of the reasons, Kim, I was so glad to get your invitation, and also why I was very enthusiastic about returning Pete Carroll's call, is that, you're nice. So is he. So, we should do nice things for nice people. And I didn't know who he was. I didn't know who the Seahawks were. I didn't know very much about NFL football, but I had the sense that the person on the other end of the line was nice and sincere, earnestly curious to have a conversation. And so that led to a friendship. And I'm happy to say he's an advisor to this nonprofit called Character Lab. And what Pete really wanted to know was, having just watched the very short TED talk that I give, he was like, why did you say that, that we can't teach grit? And I said, I didn't say we can't teach grit. I said, I didn't know how. And he said, well, come to Seattle and I will show you. So what I've learned from that great culture and that great organization, about which, by the way, Kim, you probably know much more than I do, is that, foundational to the mindset and the identity of Seahawk football players is that you can really grow. And I think that's the core ethos. And it's very related to growth mindset, which as Carol Dweck defines it at Stanford, our colleague, but also my hero, the belief that abilities like intelligence or talent are changeable, that they can grow. And I really believe that at every level of that organization and in all those micro moments, that is messaged. And nobody thinks that when you come to the Seahawks, you're going to, be exactly the same person as you were when you stepped in. I think everybody's there. Pete likes to say that his top level goal is always compete. And I think for him, the deeper meaning of that is that you should always be competing to be your best and to grow and to change.
Well, did you have impact? What happened?
Well, I kept up the conversation. I've been out there a few times. Actually, just Friday, Doug Baldwin. So for Seahawks fans, will know now retired, but a great player and also a paragon of grit. He came to my undergraduate class and was our guest lecturer / interview. And I think that for me, you know, I won't say that I actually had any impact on the way the Seahawks do anything, because for me, I was like discovering an organization that had already intuited and you know, refined a lot of things that I was just playing catch up as an academic studying. I will say though that one of the things that makes Pete Carroll interesting, and some people will have seen the, I think it was New York Times article about the Seahawks and how they had 0 cases in the pandemic of COVID, whereas I think there is no other NFL team who has that record. But he's such a learner. And one of the, I think, scientists or physicians was like, wow, he really wanted to know the science. He's the same way about psychology. So, you know, he's extremely curious. And so we've had lots of interesting conversations, but I can't take any credit for, I wish I could, right? But I don't think I can take any credit for what the Seahawks have accomplished.
Well, he has on more than one occasion and more than one venue given you credit. So I think you had an impact.
That's why I said he was nice.
He was terrific. So Danny, excuse me. You had an interesting background related to football. And I mean, one of the things that's really interesting about your background, I'm going to ask you about that in the context of another question, but I mean, you stuck with it for a while. You know, getting released by the Oakland Raiders, some people would say, okay, well, I can't do this, I'll do something else. But you didn't. You hung around for years. Didn't hung around, but you played for years. So why? I mean, diagnose that for us.
It's a great question. For me, I love the game, you know, and I think I learned at an early age what I really enjoyed doing. Mm-hmm. And as long as I was able to do that, why not, you know? And it didn't matter to me, you know, the pay in the Arena League is definitely not what the pay is in the NFL. That was okay. As long as I found a way to, you know, kind of set my future goals in other directions. I knew the Arena League wasn't going to be a long-term solution to providing for my family. But I really, there's something about competing and doing the very best that you can do and trying to grow that's like nothing else. Mm-hmm. Fortunately for me, so a lot of people, when their career in sports is over, it's like, well, now what? And honestly, in sports, we have no other skills. Like we can't do anything. And I really couldn't do anything either a few years ago. I'm starting to learn a little bit about psychology. But what was really cool was near the, you know, as I was getting up there in my Arena League years, I met Angela and I became so fascinated with psychology. And for me, it's been a transition from doing something I love and trying to discover. So Angela mentioned my top level goal earlier. For me, it's always been show what's possible. And in the context of football, that was what's possible for me. How good can I get at this particular skill of being a quarterback? But then now I was kind of, instead of like forced out, I was pulled into this other arena where I get to study questions, not just think about this in context of football, but now I get to learn, you know, what's possible for people in all different types of domains and what are the factors that lead to success. And so I think that I gained clarity early on. I want to do something I love. And thankfully I've had the opportunity to do that both in football and now in psychology.
So that, which leads me to a question that I'm going to ask you that's related to the paper you wrote with Angela. You explain it in a way that I think is really helpful. And that is, Angela's used the idea of superordinate goal or, you know, high purpose and so on. But there's a wonderful little diagram that sort of explains what that means. And I'd like to have you tell us, because, I mean, I got goals, for heaven's sake, but I may not have grit. Or I'm going to do this, but I may not have that second part, which is crucial to your discussion about grit and about perseverance and about the passion part. So you want to explain all that to us?
Explain what a superordinate goal is?
Sure, and or just explain that you have a nice little model, a little figure in your paper that helps, I think, explain it pretty well.
Yeah, so we draw on a researcher by the name of Ken Sheldon and his work in terms of what feels self-concordant. That's a fancy word for when you're doing something, what feels like it's really you. Like when we do things we're forced to do, we're making a living because somebody's paying us, we don't really like what we're doing. It feels like we're kind of, it's not really us, but we're just doing it to get, it's instrumental, it's for some other purpose. But when we're doing things that we really feels like it's an expression of who we really are, it's an intrinsic motivation, tends to be consistent with both our interests, like what do we care, like Angela's superordinate goal is a really good example. Use psychological science, that's her interest, to help kids thrive. And that's her value. And when we do things that align both our interests and our values, that can inform a superordinate goal. And that just means a long-term goal, something that's like your reason of reasons. That can help that to be sticky, something that you're not going to change every few years. So gritty people, maybe the distinguishing feature about them is not just the intensity. In fact, it's probably not intensity. It's the persistence, which is they keep the same goal. And in order to have that, it's like a compass for your life. In order to have a compass that you can follow, it helps to be really clear about what it is that you want, what it is that you care most about.
Yeah.
And then go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Angela.
Tag on to that, Danny. And I think when you think of what the lack of grit looks like, right? If really gritty people have this very clear superordinate or top level goal that gives meaning and direction to everything they do, it's aligned with their values and stimulates their interests. Like, okay, that's what grit is. What is it not then, right? So like, and I think there are a variety of ways that you could not be like that. But one way would be that you don't have that goal. And so your day is just filled with lots of stuff. In fact, honestly, yesterday I had one of those days where it was like, just scattered, like I did this, I did that. And I just didn't have any center. And then I went to bed and I was tired and a little just frazzled. And I think in a way, what this compass should enable you to do is have more days where like everything makes sense, right? And things are kind of aligned with each other in a planful way. Another way that you could lack this Tom Brady, goal clarity is if you have a very clear top level goal. It could be poetry even, right? But then you're actually not taking any action toward it, right? So you have a top level goal, but you don't have any of the goals underneath in this pyramidal structure. I think that's probably the figure you're talking about, Kim. So there's more than one way to not have this kind of goal structure. But I think that Danny and I would agree that the beautiful thing to us about the people who do have this goal structure is not necessarily that they have, Super Bowl rings or Nobel Prizes or C-suite offices, but it's that there really is like a harmony to their life. I mean, on the days that I have woken up and felt like I was really doing things that made sense for my top level goal, like I feel great. I'm like extremely fulfilled. It may not be an easy day. Might be a day full of frustration but like there is a way, and it's exactly what Danny says. Like, I feel like I'm showing up in the world as the Angela Duckworth I want to be.
It reminds me a little bit of some of the work my friend Bob Quinn does, another fellow here, Vic Strecker on our campus, who used different words, but I think a similar concept has to do with purpose in life. That is, having something that's stable, something that's superordinate, and then a bunch of goals that work toward that. That doesn't change or doesn't change very often. I mean, there may be one or two in your entire life. But the idea is, once you have that core purpose or superordinate goal, it matters a lot. People live longer. 7 or 8 years longer on the average. People make more money. All kinds of things that occur because that's in place.
I think we mean the same thing.
Yeah, I do too. And what's interesting to me about that, excuse me, and that is that grit is a mechanism. Seems like it's the thing that I can have it. I want to be, I want to help. I have a son who created a not-for-profit to help vulnerable children in Africa. And he's, I mean, he's visited multiple times, Namibia and Zimbabwe in particular, those places where children walk every day to school 3 miles and back. That's about an hour and a half to 2 hours of walking. And the reason they do that to go to school, they start in kindergarten. And then most of them only have 3 years of education. So they do that for 3 years. But the reason is they only eat 1 meal, and that's at school. Most of them don't have shoes. If they need shoes to cross difficult terrain, they have plastic bottles that they smash down, put a string around the neck and around their ankle, and that's what they walk on when they need shoes. I mean, that's the kind of children that he's trying to help. So there are a lot of people who say, gee, I'm really sorry about that, and I'd like to help, but don't do anything. And I mean, there's a whole bunch of things on the way to trying to make a difference with vulnerable children. And it seems to me, I don't know for sure, but of course, but seems to me that without grit, it's very difficult to ever achieve that superordinate goal. That is, it's the mechanism by which wonderful things happen. Is that true?
I think it is both having the goal and making it happen. So I do want to agree with you, Kim, that you know, people will say, oh, I care about this, and then not do anything. And scientists have different terms for this, but I always think of it as like the action intention gap. And it is a gap, right? Like we do not follow through on all of our intentions, and nobody's perfect. But I do think that what makes a Tom Brady or maybe your son, you know, an unusual and admirable example is that there is the follow through, and the follow through on a consistent basis. So I do think that some people might, oh, right, you're right, I should donate. And then they donate once, or like, oh, I'll think about it for 5 minutes and I'll do one thing. But it really is this consistency over time that your actions and your intentions, which themselves are lined up in this very aerodynamic way, that like they're all in harmony and they're in action. And Danny and I also love the work on being a locomotor, which, you know, is, again, not our research, but I do think that gritty people are locomotors in the sense that they have a like visceral desire to like do stuff and to not only have goals, but to make those goals actually happen.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you 2 different questions, 2 sides of the same coin. One is, how do you develop grit or grittiness? So Daniel, why don't you take a crack at that? I mean, if you got called up by, I don't know, Andy Reid and said, geez, we just are disappointed at, and by the way, I'm a fan of Andy Reid's. I'm also, of course, a fan of Tom Brady's. But if Andy Reid called you up and said, my guys are down, we're finished. I need to have you come in and help us develop grit. So and since you've got football background, you know the language. So what would you do?
Well, as Angela said, I think you need 2 things. But the place I think I would start is helping people develop a clear compass, a clear superordinate goal. And the reason why I say that is because you can be really persistent, but if you're not persistent towards a particular direction, that's not motivating. And so for me, and I don't have particular data to support this, but my intuition is that starting with someone's superordinate goal is really important. So with Andy Reid, they just lost the Super Bowl. It's devastating. Is your goal to win the Super Bowl this year? Is that your superordinate goal? Or is your goal something more like Pete Carroll's, always compete? Or is it something that's a little bit more abstract that allows you to have more ways than one to achieve it? So one of the things we talk about in our paper is when you set a really great long-term goal, it's not something that today is going to make or break you. And you see, when you have this long-term goal, it's like, sorry to use this kind of corny metaphor, but when I was learning to drive, my dad, I would kind of go between the lanes a lot. And my dad said, Danny, you got to stop looking right in front of you. You got to look off in the distance. You have to steer high. And when I would steer high, I was able to stay, and it was a lot easier to kind of navigate the car. And I think it's kind of that way in life. When we know where we're going in the long run, a Super Bowl loss is unfortunate, but there are multiple pathways to achieve something like to compete at your best, compete at your very best. And so getting really clear as to why you're doing something. I'll just say, because Tom Brady is the man of the hour, and we're talking in Michigan, here's a quote I love from Tom Brady that I just pulled up while we were talking. He lost the Super Bowl a few years ago, lost to the Eagles. And there's a documentary he did on Facebook. And after he's on camera and he said, well, you know, what are you going to play next year? And he said, I'm sitting here, laying here 3 days after the season, getting my Achilles worked on and my thumb. He's got really injured. He said, here's what Tom Brady said. He said, you know, I asked myself, what are we doing this for? You know, what are we doing this for? Who are we doing this for? Why are we doing this? And then he says this, you got to have answers to those questions. Mm-hmm. They got to be with a lot of conviction. You know, when you lose your conviction, then you should probably be doing something else. And so I think getting really clear as to why you're doing something helps you to have that direction. And then of course there's the following through on that, but that would be the place that I would start.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Angela, anything else?
I think we could have long debates, and Kim, you and the faculty at Ross would have much more to say than Danny or I about how important is the leader. Have we romanticized the leader? Like, have we overestimated the effect of a leader? I also don't want to underestimate the effect of a leader. And I love this quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson. You know, an organization is the long extended shadow of its leader. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Pete Carroll has created the Seahawks in his own like image in terms of his values and his karma. Like, you know, they play music loudly, they're always joking around, they're playing practical jokes. That's Pete's personality. And I do think that among the, you know, many things that we have to admire about somebody like Tom Brady is that it's not just that he's technically awesome and he has like great peripheral vision. I mean, he has shown leadership and has created, I think, or at least helped shape a culture in his new team that takes excellence seriously, that thinks of it as a daily devotion, that, you know, is about responsibility and not blame when it comes to like a missed play, et cetera. So I do think that one of the pieces of advice then for leaders is that you are a role model. Your organization is your long extended shadow, and therefore you should be intentional about what you're modeling.
Yeah, I love those answers. Let me flip the coin. Is there a downside to grit? That is it related to anxiety, to depression, to guilt, to a bunch of those kinds of things when failure occurs, especially in children? I mean, is there other side to grit that we at least ought to be aware of?
I have two answers to that question. First,
Great.
I will say from the data, Kim, that like most things in psychology, like good things go with good things. So if you measure a child's happiness, you know, their level of positive emotion, the absence of negative emotion like anxiety or worry, and also a feeling of satisfaction with their life overall, it goes with grit, not against grit. But that's kind of true of like pretty much everything that a psychologist would study, that good things go with good things. So on one hand, I can say, Kim, don't worry so much, right? Like really gritty children tend to be pretty happy overall. On the other hand, I do think, and I do worry about, you know, for example, when I have parents who seem to only want to make their kids gritty and accomplished and are not asking questions about empathy, compassion, honesty, kindness, curiosity, intellectual humility, social intelligence, you know, the list goes on. And that is why I call this nonprofit Character Lab, to be just inclusive of all the things that Aristotle and Martin Luther King and Maria Montessori said are important to develop in life. And that is not just grit. So I do think there's probably a trade-off. If you, for example, singly honor one value like grit and do that to the neglect of others. And I think recent political events have shown us examples of what it looks like to be gritty with without other aspects of character.
Yeah, that's a wonderful way to think about it, in my view. I mean, part of my own work is a study of the effect of virtuousness, kindness, compassion, honesty, and so on organizations, on leaders, and on organization performance. Turns out there's actually bottom line impact, profitability, productivity, quality. Doesn't have to be. I mean, if I'm kind to Danny only to get what I want, it's no longer kindness. So I don't need a payback. but those attributes you just highlighted that are related to this package of things we call grit, and grit is part of that, matters a lot in organizations. So, Danny, you saw in your background a whole bunch of people who kind of hung in there or through their careers, and a bunch of people who did not. I mean, was it grit that determined the difference? And did you see a downside of guys who just did not have the skill, the capability, the talent, and who got beat up every day? I mean, I'm thinking about Rudy. You know, Rudy So what about grit? Is there a downside to grit?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think most traits taken to their extreme, like Aristotle would say, you know, can be problematic. And so if you're being really gritty about something that is not feasible, it might lead to negative outcomes, particularly if you're risking other things in the process. What kept certain players playing, what keeps people doing things? I think grit is, in terms of the individual, like what relates to the individual, I think that, in my view, grit probably is the thing that kept people going the most. But the individual isn't the only contributor to any particular outcome. What do I mean by that? Well, in any given circumstance, you can have a really gritty person that might have a situation that doesn't enable their grit to come through. So maybe someone, some players quit. In fact, there was just a movie that came out about a player who came from a difficult background, and his mom ended up having to go to a rehab center, and his little brother, it's this Disney movie, it's a great movie, I don't remember the name of it, but he had to raise his brother while he was playing college football. And this was feasible for him because his coaches made it possible. For a lot of players, they might be super gritty, but their circumstance, the environmental circumstance, doesn't allow them to do it. So I think another way that grit could go wrong is when we assume that the only reason someone doesn't succeed is because they lack grit. Because the reality is that the individual has to be there. They have to have the right internal characteristics to persevere, but also the situation needs to be such that persevering is possible or profitable in a given circumstance.
Yeah. I love it. So we're getting near the end of our time, but let me just ask each of you to respond. What's next? That is, you have made really wonderful contributions. I mean, the grit research, the stuff on talent is just a kind of an eye opener. Hey, we ought to be thinking about this. So what comes next, and what ought we to be thinking about? And if you're going to say, we need progress in this direction, what might you say? Angela, you want to start?
Well, I am new to business schools, by the way, Kim. So
well, doesn't matter,
It's been a wonderfully steep learning curve for me, but I really would, among other things, like to pursue the question of what grit looks like in an organizational context. Like, how do we build gritty cultures? What advice do we have for gritty leaders or leaders who want to be grittier? And how should we be redesigning jobs in order to enable people to have more passion and perseverance? So one answer is, I'm happy to be, newly jointly appointed at Wharton and like hanging out with people like you, Kim, and maybe some others who are on this call. And then more broadly, I will say what wakes me up in the morning is I'm trying to figure out, and this might be a fool's errand, whether there is like a more like universal, like, the grand theory of behavior and behavior change, where we can like put Danny Kahneman's thing here and the stuff that Danny and I are doing on talent and grit and like put it all together. So far, I've not come up with a grand unifying theory. I mean, I'm trying, but I'm waking up thinking about that every day.
That's fantastic. And by the way, I hope that we'll have a chance to converse a lot more. I mean, I'm really serious about this. Your work has such implication for so many different arenas, certainly business, but lots of other places as well. So, Danny, what's next for you?
Well, writing our recent paper, about grit in organizations got me thinking an awful lot about how the environment contributes to this characteristic, to grit. You know, for 20 years, the predominant area of which grit was studied is you measure grit, someone takes a survey, and then you see what the results are. But what if grit was the dependent variable? And there's been a little research on that, but I think in organization, what do I mean by dependent variable? Sometimes I get in my PhD talk. If grit is something we're studying on the other end, not what grit predicts, but what predicts grit. I'm really interested in, like Angela said, thinking about what types of leaders produce gritty employees. I'm really interested in this question. What cultural features create grit? So there's some really interesting research by Jenny Chapman at the University of California at Berkeley. And she has shown that the culture contributes to behavior several times more than individual. In other words, if you're looking at person-organization fit, what predicts behavior? Is it the person, how they are when they come into an organization, or is it the organization's culture? The organization's culture predicts about 40% of how a person fits, and then the person predicts about 15%. So what does that say? It says that we're studying grit, and grit seems to lead to important effects, but there seems to be so much more that we can study in terms of what leads to it. It's not some stable thing. And I think that was the key theme, or a key theme of our paper, is that if people think grit is something you have or don't, that's certainly not Angela's view or my view. Yeah, that's what I want. That's what I'm interested in looking at in the future.
And Danny looks forward to getting his PhD too.
That's right. And in your paper, you've mentioned the relationship between grit and job design and culture and performance and what else, work engagement and so on. So there are a bunch of organization-related, relatively popular topics or themes that you've addressed in this paper. And I think you've done a really nice job of making grit relevant in the business world. Well, I have to say again, we are flattered to have you accept the invitation to come, and inspired and improved a lot. I mean, we've learned a lot by having you come with us and talk to us, and we hope this isn't the last time we have a chance to collaborate and learn from each other. Now, there are some comments in the chat box, and I don't know, Angie, whether or not those are questions that we should answer, whether or not we want to open this up at all. We only have about 2 minutes, but I can just wrap it up now unless there's something that we need to identify in the chat box or respond to in the chat box. Can you help us?
I think Angie just chatted back. Nope, we can't open it up.
Okay.
That's the answer from Angie.
All right.
Well, texted or chatted. How about a closing remark from each Angela and Danny? Should we do it, Angie?
Do you want closing remarks? Do you want to have? I know I always hate closing remarks. I never have anything pithy to say. But do you have something pithy to say?
I don't know if we have anything pithy to say. I will say this. I think in some ways, like you think, like, what does a scientist do? They run all these statistics, or to me, like this conversation, Kim, like this kind of conversation also, like this is where like all the good ideas really come from and get refined. So thank you. I think Danny and I both learned as much as we said, and we look forward to more conversations.
Thank you, Angela. Danny, all right?
Sure. Next yeah. I think it just said we have 5 minutes. If that's right, maybe we'll have a little bit more than a brief comment at the end, or we can end a little early. But I will say, like, if I were to a closing remark is, I think the message of our talent research is to be careful about the messages that are being sent to employees with the words that we use. So talent is, statistic we looked at the other day, is 130 times more, talent management is 130 times more common today than it was in 1990. So talent management is a fairly new thing. It used to always be human resources, KSAOs, knowledge, skills, and other abilities, I think was another term people use. Now talent management is this really popular term. And And that's might indicate that, you know, people are valuing their employees more. They're referring to them as talents, but there also might be this other side. And so I think Angela and my recommendation is probably to not use that phrase until we have a more clear understanding of what is meant. But it's probably people won't follow that recommendation not to use it. I mean, there's talent, the word talent is everywhere, and people are going to continue to use it. So to the extent that people do use it, make sure that you're being super clear about what you intend by it. And if you intend, as would be supported in a gritty culture or a growth mindset culture, that talent can be developed, that abilities can be developed, be very clear about that fact and or that idea, instead of leaving it up to employees to interpret, well, what does the boss mean by talent? What does my manager mean? Do they mean that some people have the ability to develop and others don't? If you're really clear with employees, we think that might reduce the negative impact that using this ambiguous term might have.
Thank you.
Let me add a postscript to that. You know, there's this very famous expression in business, and, you know, politicians are like, watch your thoughts for they become your words. And then it goes on. But I think Danny's research also says, like, watch your words for they can become your thoughts. And yeah. Like, as in so many things in life, it really goes both ways.
I love it. And coupling that with that notion of growth mindset, so long as you never lose the idea that you can grow, should grow. We're in that process, all of us. Well, just by way of closure, I want to thank Angela and Danny so much for being with us and for accepting the invitation. You're terrific.